It was almost real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 110. Hello, and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from the 1860s to 1930, except for today when we are going to jump all the way up into 1983. So in this episode, I will be discussing Larry Matysik's starting an Outlaw promotion in St. Louis during 1983. But first, I'm decided to push the planned episode for this week to next week, and it may just be Trey and I. We're going to talk about Ad Santel's tour of Japan in 1921, and we're going to review the first Survivor Series match between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant's team. It's a match on the first Survivor Series, is how I should have put that. It's been difficult to coordinate me, Trey, and Caleb's schedule, so it may just be me and Trey for that one. I have to accept the fact that most of the time I'm going to be doing these episodes solo because it's very difficult to coordinate all our schedules. When they're able to join, it'll be a treat. And I mean, I may even be able to get my grandsons on occasionally. We're going to the History Museum next Friday, so after that, maybe we'll record an episode. And on a personal update, I did successfully test for my fifth degree black belt. Trey and Caleb were my assistants to demonstrate for that test because you have to do walking drills, which I don't need a partner for or forms, but the timing drills and self defenses I do need partners for. Trey was reminding me that, he may or may not still be active when I test for, well, not when, if I test for my sixth degree black belt, because that's dependent on a number of factors, including my instructor still being teaching. But if I test for sixth degree, Solomon will actually be 14 at that time, and he could be one of my partners for the demonstrations. I never feel old, but when I think about that, maybe just a little bit. So I wanted to give a book update, and then I'm just going to talk about a couple of random subjects that came up this week. I've talked about how I've been working on this second edition of the St. Louis Civil War and how it's been kind of slow going because there's a brutal level of violence in this book. One of the things that's difficult about this, well, it's not difficult about the book, but it's one of the more horrible aspects of the strike is so many innocent people were hit with bricks or stray bullets because you had a bunch of people running around at that time who were armed because the sheriff deputized a bunch of citizens, many of them against their will, to help protect the streetcars. So you have a bunch of untrained people running around with guns, some of them playing cowboy, some of them not even wanting to be there, and most of them did not know which end of the tube the projectile came out on that firearm. When they shoot at someone, they're more likely to hit the person 10 feet or 10 yards away from them than they are the person that they're shooting at. How I'm dealing with that brutal level of violence, just not to make the book just one big orgy of violence, is I am now adding little St. Louis history facts and tidbits in there to kind of break up all these violent episodes. So why does St. Louis have both a police department and a sheriff's department? How long was St. Louis the biggest city west of the Mississippi? And what was the peak population of the city of St. Louis? So I'm just trying to add these little facts in as I get a chance. And it is breaking up some of the monotony of, well, this person got hit with a brick and this person got shot and this person was standing in the yard half a block away minding their own business when they were shot. So I hope it makes the book more readable, and I'm hoping to finish the book in mid-December. More to come on that. Leaving wrestling for a second and going into MMA, I want to congratulate Islam Makhachev on becoming a double champ. One of my favorite fighters, and I think the best pound for pound fighter in the world today, is Islam Makhachev. Amazing fighter. His interactions with DC, Daniel Cormier, are hilarious. So I'm happy for him. I would like to see him be the GOAT one day if his training partner, Khabib, is already not the GOAT. I'm going to end with a couple of wrestling things before we jump into the main content. So I have not had a chance to watch it yet, but WWE aired another one of the AAA events on November 22nd. And the main event is El Hijo del Vikingo and Dragon Lee versus El Grande Americano and Dominic Mysterio. So that's the main event, was El Vikingo and Dragon Lee versus Dominic and El Grande Americano. This poor El Hijo del Vikingo, they, as soon as they show his picture on the very beginning, when they, they're because WWE and UFC are now under the umbrella organization of TKO, they're sharing some production people. So now, just like with the UFC, when you have the UFC fighters walking in and they're filming them, every wrestling show now starts with the wrestlers walking in the building. And El Vikingo starts walking in the building, and the people are booing him out of the building. And I feel so bad for the guy because he's done nothing. The people are mad because WWE does not want to work with Alberto Del Rio, Alberto El Patron, because of their past history. So they wanted the title put on someone else. Well, AAA put the title on El Hijo del Vikingo. And in the match where he won the title, the fans were cheering him. He was obviously the babyface. Alberto El Patron, on a talk show in Mexico, had attacked his father, the original Vikingo. And so he was set up as the babyface, and the fans cheered like crazy. I wouldn't say babies were going in the air, but he was very popular winning the championship. And they were still cheering him when he had the rematch with Alberto Del Rio. The problem is, when I say Alberto Del Rio, that's his WWE name. I know most of the time he wrestles under Alberto El Patron now because he's not allowed to use the WWE intellectual property. He's actually the son of the legendary Mexican wrestler Dos Caras and the nephew of Mil Mascaras. Once the fans, though, figured out that the reason Vikingo had the title was because WWE does not want to work with Alberto El Patron, the fans turned on the poor guy. And they boo him out of the building now. The fans cheered. I think babies probably did go in the air when Dominic beat him for the title and they took the title off him. And I'm watching the guy walk in and I'm like, they're going to have to turn this poor guy heel. And he's not done a thing in the world. He didn't tell them, hey, put the title on me because WWE doesn't want to work with Alberto El Patron. That was conversations between AAA and WWE. But when the fans don't want something, the fans don't want something. It's like when Vince was going to push Roman Reigns as his number one babyface, no matter what anybody said, no matter what anybody thought. So he continued to push Roman Reigns, and the fans just booed Roman Reigns out of the buildings. It's not Roman Reigns' fault that Vince has chosen him, but when the fans don't want it, the fans don't want it. And boy, they don't want it right now because poor El Hijo del Vikingo, you would think that he was some kind of mass murderer or something, the way they're booing the poor guy. And he is a very talented wrestler. Oh, I just feel bad for him. The 2025 Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. Let me first say I don't disagree with anybody that went in this year. I think that Dory Dixon, it's great he's still alive. Unfortunately, Grant Hamada has passed away this year, as did Sabu. But I can't argue with any of the inductions. But one did shock me, and that is that CM Punk got in. And I really didn't think with the voters for the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame that he would get in, because the people that read the Wrestling Observer tend to be a little bit more fans of independent wrestling, a little bit more fans of AEW. CM Punk was considered the villain with those fans, and it also, maybe there is hope for the tribalism in wrestling today, because there are people that are just diehard WWE fans and AEW is horrible. There are people that are diehard AEW fans and WWE can do nothing right. And it's, guys, you can like both. You know, there's no rule, there's no book of rules out there that says you cannot be a fan of both unless you've created that rule for yourself in your own mind. But maybe it shows that people can overcome that tribalism, because I never thought CM Punk would get in after he left AEW the way he did. AEW fans definitely seem to blame Punk for the way that whole thing ended. There were memes up on social media after Tony Khan fired CM Punk that said Tony Khan cured cancer. He went from AEW to WWE and became one of the biggest stars in the business again. And nobody can argue with the kind of business that the WWE is doing, and CM Punk is a big part of that. That was a shock, but what I think is just absolutely insane is Drew McIntyre did not get enough votes to even qualify for next year. And that's just a joke. You have the biggest heel for the biggest company. And I've said before, I don't think anybody that is a current wrestler, including CM Punk, should go into the Hall of Fame before their career is over with. However, that ship sailed a long time ago. This Hall of Fame has always had active wrestlers in it. So, by the criteria and by how they put people in the Hall of Fame for the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, all of the people that are in there, for the most part, you can make an argument for all of them. Drew McIntyre is the biggest heel, one of the best wrestlers in the biggest company, and he doesn't even get 10% of the vote to qualify for next year's ballot. So I don't know who he pissed off, but he obviously pissed off someone. And then I still think two of the biggest glaring admissions, besides Morris Siegel and a couple of the historic wrestling promoters, the two big ones from the ballot this year, and I saw that they were in the 50% range, is Junkyard Dog and Gorilla Monsoon. Dog, for a wrestler in Calgary, Mid South. If you only saw him in the WWE, you saw him towards the end of his career where he put on a lot of weight and he wasn't what he had once been in Mid South because he let his weight get out of control. And even in Calgary, Junkyard Dog had a tremendous 2, 3 year run there in Mid South. And yes, it was only 2 or 3 years, but he was also the biggest baby face under Hogan during the early years of the expansion. You can't take away what he meant to the company that was going national at the time either. Gorilla Monsoon, I find the most glaring admission, and I know that a lot of the smart fans don't like Gorilla's commentary, but I thought Gorilla's commentary was just fine. It was memorable. It was funny. Yes, he used a lot of cliches, but that was not unusual for wrestling announcers back in the day. They all can't be Larry Matysik. Yes, my bias is showing. And then Gorilla was a tremendous main event wrestler, but almost none of the video exists of that anymore. So you can understand why fans are not as familiar with that, because there's hardly any video at all of Gorilla as a wrestler. But Gorilla as the promotional force, he was a part owner of the WWE or WWF at the time, going back to when Toots Mondt sold his shares in the late 1960s. At first, they wanted to offer it to Bruno, but Bruno passed and said, well, what about Gino? They ended up selling those shares to Gorilla, and Gorilla he wasn't really a booker. He would have been one of the bookers. but he was critical to the success of the television tapings, to a lot of the shows, to some of the angles and how some of the storylines came off. So, for all of those, for his contributions as a wrestler, as a promoter, he was a part owner, and as an announcer, he should, without question, be in the Hall of Fame. I would have never ever been a WWF, later WWE fan if it were not for Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan. So that is a glaring admission that Gorilla is still not in the Hall of Fame. So let's talk about the topic I wanted to talk about this week. And this was something I saw in the last few weeks, triggered me thinking about the short lived St. Louis wrestling promotion in 1983 that Larry Matysik started to run against the St. Louis Wrestling Club, which had been the promotion in St. Louis since the late 40s. Well, actually, it was called something else, but it traces all the way back to Sam Muchnick's origins in 1945. Well, actually, 42. So before I confuse anybody any further, let me go back and just talk a little bit about Sam's history, how Larry got involved, and then how he ended up running Outlaw. So I'm going to start with Sam, then I'm going to go to Larry. And the reason I'm wanted to talk about this is because I knew I had gone to two of the shows, and when I was looking up some, I thought that they only ran four shows, so I had been to 50% of them. Well, actually, I was at 33% of them because they ran six shows over 4 months, almost 5 months, and we'll talk about those here in a few minutes as well. Sam Muchnick got started covering wrestling when he was a sports writer for the St. Louis Times newspaper. And he was a sports writer, I think, for about 5 years, primarily focused on baseball. And Sam knew all the sports writers in St. Louis because of his stint with the St. Louis Times. Besides covering baseball, he also covered wrestling. He was a wrestling fan, and he covered it as a sport, which the longtime St. Louis promoter Tom Pax appreciated. When the St. Louis Star and Times merged in 1932. So from I think 1926 to 1932, Sam wrote for the St. Louis Times. There was another paper called the St. Louis Star. And in 1932, those two papers merged into the St. Louis Star Times. When they merged, they got rid of Sam Muchnick because they were combining all the departments. So there were newspaper reporters that were let go, and Sam was one of the newspaper reporters let go. However, he had cultivated a relationship with Tom Pax, and Tom Pax hired him in 1932 to be his public relations person. Pretty quickly, Tom Pax saw how capable Sam was in a number of areas in the business, and he brought him into the office as his main assistant, besides being his public relations guy. And he also started to teach Sam booking. And they had a fairly harmonious relationship from 1932 until 1941. In 1941, Pax promotes a boxing event, which Sam helps him out. And the boxing event in St. Louis drew a profit of $14,000, which was pretty good for guys that were normally wrestling promoters who were doing this one off boxing promotion. However, Tom Pax only gives him $200 as a bonus for helping him with this boxing promotion and makes Sam angry. Sam quits, and Sam starts his own wrestling promotion in 1942. He ran one show before he was off into the military because World War II had broken out. So Sam goes into the Army Air Force, and he serves during World War II. And in 1945, after the war is over, he is discharged back to civilian service, and he announces his intention to go back into wrestling promotion. So he'd run a show before he was called up into the Army Air Force. And now he is going to be a wrestling promoter again. He's having trouble, though, getting off the ground because a lot of the wrestling promoters are allied with Tom Pax. There is no NWA, there's no controlling group, so to say, but there's always been sort of an alliance of promoters, and they don't like people getting into their business. So it was very hard for Sam to book talent. But he did manage to struggle along with the help of Jack Pfeffer, which is one of the reasons Sam and Jack Pfeffer were always friendly, because Jack Pfeffer sent him talent from time to time. And Sam is able to make it a couple of years when he is approached by Pinky George, who is the promoter in Iowa, Tony Stecker, who is the promoter in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I think the third promoter was Eddie Quinn up in Montreal. And they want to start a group of, or they want to group together as promoters and form their own wrestling association, because the big body, there was also an AWA based out of Boston, but the National Wrestling Association, which was affiliated with the National Boxing Association, was the big governing body at the time and had their world champion, and they were affiliated with a lot of the athletic commissions. But the National Wrestling Association could be manipulated by some of the powerful promoters like Tom Pax, who was a power broker in the National Wrestling Association. So these promoters' idea was to band together, create their own wrestling alliance, which would be a voluntary group of these promoters, and they would share talent, and they would create a world champion, and they would share in the profits of those world championship matches. Sam agrees. They all form this National Wrestling Alliance, and Pinky George is the first president of the National Wrestling Alliance. Sam would end up being the president from the late, I think, 49 until maybe 57, and then again from 1963 until 1975. And the National Wrestling Alliance becomes the dominant body pretty quickly. And after Orville Brown, who was the first National Wrestling Alliance champion, is injured in a car accident and can no longer wrestle, the National Wrestling Association champion Lou Thesz is selected to be the world champion. And from that point on, the National Wrestling Alliance title and the National Wrestling Association title are combined into one world title, and the National Wrestling Alliance champion or championship is the dominant championship. National Wrestling Association world title ceases to exist at that point. One of the main things the NWA did was protect its members against outlaws. So if an outlaw promotion started in one of the NWA territories, the other promoters would send a bunch of talent, so they would hotshot the area for a while with these super cards until they would run the outlaw promotion out, and then things would go back to normal. So you have this association that's trying to get rid of outlaw promotions. Sam was the president for a long time. So now we're going to jump forward to January 1st, 1982. Sam Muchnick has his retirement card. He sells the promotion to Bob Geigel and Pat O'Connor. And Pat O'Connor was a longtime St. Louis booker, and Geigel, O'Connor, Harley Race, and Vern Gagne all had points in St. Louis, meaning they had minority ownership, but Sam was the majority owner and still controlled everything. Sam in 1963 had hired, I may be off on, yes, 1963, he hired Larry Matysik as sort of his office boy helper, because Larry was a huge wrestling fan from Belleville, Illinois. After Larry graduates high school, he's working for Sam a little bit more. I think he was also doing some other stuff as he was going through college. But in the early 1970s, Sam replaces his announcer with Larry Matysik. And people talk about their voice of their childhood for wrestling. For me, the voice of my childhood for wrestling was Larry Matysik. He was the announcer when I started watching wrestling in, I think, 1979. And he was the announcer that sparked my interest in historical professional wrestling because he knew so much about wrestling history. And he would throw little tidbits in there every week about, oh yeah, the Irish Whip created by Dan O'Mahony, and oh yeah, the first mass wrestler in the United States was a mass marvel in the 1915 International Wrestling Tournament in New York. And it was listening to Larry's commentary that got me interested in researching the history of professional wrestling. While Larry was the longtime announcer and Sam's right hand man, he did not buy into the promotion, and he was not he did not buy into the promotion when Sam retired. Geigel and Pat O'Connor start trying to run St. Louis like Kansas City, and it definitely, after a few maybe 5 or 6 months, it definitely started to disaffect the fans. I'll use my sister Vicky and me as an example. Vicky had season tickets, which is what they called them. It means you had the same seats for an entire year of professional wrestling. She had season tickets, but had not been going because no one would go with her. Well, when my parents were getting married, my mom and my stepdad, I met my sisters, my older sisters, and Vicky had heard that I was a wrestling fan. She was 15 years older than me. And my sister Vicky said, "Hey, if I'd come pick you up, will you go to the wrestling matches with me?" I said, "Absolutely." She says, "I want to go, but I've got season tickets, but nobody will go with me, so I haven't been going." So I went and looked up, and I'm pretty sure that the week after my mom and dad got married, because I was down in the country for a week, we went to our first card in St. Louis. And we did not go to every single card in 81 and 82 because there were a few times Vicky had to work. There was one time I was sick because the time I was sick, she brought me back. She knew the security guys down at the Keel, and she got one of them to take the program back to Kerry and David Von Erich, and they signed my program. I've got it around here somewhere. But we went to most of them in 1981 and 1982, and we were at Sam's retirement card January 1st, 1982, at the Checkerdome. We probably went to 80% of the cards that Geigel and O'Connor were putting on in 82. But outside of the ones that the Von Erichs were on, it was not anywhere near as good as it had been under Sam. We weren't the only ones that felt that. Larry Matysik apparently felt that too. At the end of 82, Vicky said, "You know what? This is getting pretty bad. I'm not going to get season tickets next year. Why don't we just go to the cards that we're interested in from now?" And I said, "Yeah, that sounds great." I'm not sure we went to a card in 83. We went to a few in 84, and those were the last ones we went to. I had thought we were actually still going up into 85 and 86, but when I go back and I look at the cards, I don't think so. I think the last card Vicky and I went to was in 84. That's how bad. You had a promotion that Sam had founded in the 40s that up until the 80s would draw 9 to 10,000 fans every, because he ran about every 3 weeks on a Friday night. St. Louis was a Friday night town, and it ran about every 3 weeks. So Sam would put on about 17, 18 cards a year. And we were very religious in going in 81. And in the first part of 82, we went. By the end of 82, we were really disaffected. And I think we went to about 4 cards in 1984. So these guys wrecked what Sam had built pretty quickly. Larry is fed up because he's been trying to talk to these guys. Sam had told him to listen to Larry when he retired. And Pat O'Connor and Larry had a relationship, but it didn't matter because they weren't listening. They were doing things their way. So Larry not only resigned from the St. Louis Wrestling Club, he went and spoke with Sam about starting a rival promotion. So Larry is going to run Outlaw now, which the NWA has been dead set against. But Sam, who personally cares for Larry, also ran Outlaw when he first started. Hit the first 4 years of his wrestling promotion, he would have been considered an outlaw wrestling promotion. So Sam gives him permission and speaks to a few promoters who do send Larry talent. But the problem for Larry is, as an outlaw promotion, most of the NWA talent is off limits. So he has to go to promotions that are not involved with the NWA. Well, he's not going to get talent from the AWA because Vern Gagne is a part owner in St. Louis. But he does get a lot of his talent from Southwest Championship Wrestling in San Antonio because Joe Blanchard was out of the NWA. So he gets some talent there. He gets Randy Savage and Lanny Poffo from IWA because they're an outlaw promotion. And he gets Bruiser Brody, who's one of the big free agents and one of Larry's closest friends. And the two biggest stars for Larry during his short lived promotion are Bruiser Brody and Spike Huber. And Spike Huber is Dick the Bruiser's son in law. And WWA, Dick the Bruiser's promotion, which is about on its last legs, is not affiliated with the NWA either. So he can get WWA talent. There's one person on the TV show we're going to review in a little bit that I believe was actually from Herb Simmons' Southern Illinois promotion, which is a small kind of independent promotion in Southern Illinois, but it was loosely affiliated with the St. Louis office. Herb worked with Larry and Sam Muchnick, and I think Herb was one of Larry's best friends. So he would get a little bit of talent from Herb too. The Greater St. Louis Wrestling Enterprises ran 6 shows starting on June 18th, 1983, up until October 29th, 1983. And the first card, 6/18/1983, drew 4,121 fans to the Checker Dome, which is a good crowd for a upstart promotion. Remember, St. Louis is normally drawing 9 to 10,000 people every 3 weeks. The problem is, and one of the reasons it was going to be very difficult for Larry to be profitable, he could not get the Kiel Auditorium at first. I think he did get Kiel, but he couldn't get the Kiel Auditorium at first, which is the smaller venue in town at the time. He has to run the Checker Dome. And the Checker Dome is a huge building set up for hockey that can hold 20,000 fans. So they would put a curtain down the middle of it. So you were only using half of it, but he was never even able to fill half of it. And even with Larry's connections, if he was getting a discount on the building, it still probably wasn't going to be enough for him to make a profit. But he did try. So the first show, he has an issue already because Blackjack Mulligan no shows it. The main event is supposed to be Bruiser Brody versus Blackjack Mulligan, and Blackjack Mulligan no shows. And so he ends up putting King Hung Brody on in the fifth match. Brody defeats Dick Young and Larry Powers in a handicap match. The main event ends up becoming Adrian Adonis versus Scott Casey. Adrian Adonis at the time had what was Southwest Championship Wrestling called the Undisputed World Heavyweight Championship because they had had a tournament in San Antonio where they invited all of the world champions, which of course nobody came. That was supposedly for the undisputed title. Nobody ever really took that serious. But the opening match was Mark Dartel defeating Max Blue in a match that went 8 minutes 12 seconds. And this is the first card I attended. So I attended their first card. And I didn't go with my sister Vicky. A friend of mine from the neighborhood named Jeff had tickets. And I think the reason I ended up going is his parents wouldn't let him go unless I went too. So we went to 2 of these cards. And the second match was Debbie Combs defeating Donna Day. Spike Huber, who I told you was the other guy that they were going to push, defeated Vic Peterson. And then a 2-on-1 handicap match the Poffos, Angelo Poffo and Lanny Poffo, defeated Moose Cholak, and I think that may be the original Moose Cholak. And then the person who stole this show and who made the biggest impression on me, biggest impression on me, the biggest impression on me during this short-lived promotion was Randy Savage, who was claiming to be the IWA World Champion even on this show. He defeated Doug Vines in a match that went 9 minutes and 10 seconds, and you could not help but be impressed by how good this guy was. 2 years later, he's probably the best wrestler in the world, but Savage was incredible. Match that went on last but was not the main event, it was just kind of the show closer, was Sweet Brown Sugar and the one of the worst perverts of all time, Bob Sweetan, defeating Tully Blanchard and Bobby Jaggers. That was the first show, and I was at that one. The second show drew 4,118 people, so 3 people less than the show before, and it was on July 22nd. This show started off with Tony Atlas, and he defeated Max Blue in 4 minutes and 18 seconds. Max Blue was the guy that was just going to go out there and put over anybody in the opening match. Then it was Angelo Poffo and Mike Duggendorf, who I've never heard of before, defeating Doug Vines and Moose Cholak. Doug Vines was another IWA wrestler. Then Scott Casey versus Tiger Conway Jr. I think this was Tiger Conway Jr.'s short-lived run as a heel. Ended without a winner as a double countout in 11 minutes. I think they fought outside the ring. Dominic DeNucci and Roberto Soto defeated Hans Schroeder and Victor Rivera. So we were getting some Northeast talent. These guys would do enhancement stuff for WWE, but they were also independent guys on the Northeast circuit. Then Bobby Jaggers versus Sweet Brown Sugar went to a 20-minute draw. Randy Savage defeated Big Boy Williams. That's an IWA match. Tully Blanchard defeated Bob Sweetan. Bob Sweetan, believe it or not, was a face some of the time in Southwest Championship Wrestling. And this was when Sweetan was feuding with Blanchard and Gino Hernandez. I don't think Gino ever came up to St. Louis, though. And then Nikolai Volkov and Professor Toru Tanaka defeated King Kong Brody and Spike Huber by disqualification in 5 minutes, 47 seconds. I think that Brody hit one of them with a chair. And then they had a 22-man battle royal. It was a 2-ring battle royal. The winner was going to get a shot at Adrian Adonis's undisputed World Heavyweight Championship. The winner in ring 1 was Tully Blanchard. The winner in ring 2 was Spike Huber. And Spike Huber won the match and ended up getting the title shot at Adrian Adonis. So the first 2 cards drew about 4,000 fans each. Now they start picking up momentum with the second card. Or I'm sorry, the third card. And they draw 6,824 fans to this card on August 19th, 1983. The opening match on this one is Al Perez versus Coco Samoa, so we're getting a little bit better talent. Then Debbie Combs defeats Donna Day. That's a rematch from a couple months ago. Jerry Oates defeats Bull Brannigan. Then Tully Blanchard, Eddie Mansfield, and Hans Schroeder defeat Tom Pritchard, Scott Casey, and Brian Madden. Brian Madden was a kid from Belleville who I believe was one of the guys wrestling for Herb Simmons at the time. Nikolai Volkov defeats Mike Milton. Bob Sweetan and Dick Murdoch defeat Tiger Conway Jr. and Randy Savage. Now, you talk about an oddball tag team. Bob Sweetan and Dick Murdoch, who I believe were the faces, defeated Tiger Conway Jr. and Randy Savage in 12 minutes, 26 seconds. And then Adrian Adonis versus Spike Huber ended without a winner as a time limit draw at 20 minutes. And Luthez was the special guest referee. And King Kong Brody defeated Toru Tanaka. And you know what? I am wrong. I went to three of the shows, so I did go to 50% because I was at this show. Because I remember Tiger Conway Jr. and Randy Savage teaming up, and I vaguely remember Spike Huber versus Adrian Adonis. So I was at three of the. I was at 50% of the cards. I was at the June 18th show. I was at the August 19th show, and then I was at the September 17th show. That's the one I remember the best. And that was the biggest crowd that Larry ever drew, 6,962 fans. And I remember this card because Brody fought Volkov in the main event. And Randy Savage put on stole the show again. But the show starts off with Al Perez and Chavo Guerrero defeating Eric Embry and Hans Schroeder. So the talent is getting a little better. We don't have Max Blue in the opening match. Then we have Buddy Landel wrestling Tom Pritchard to a 20-minute draw. Dominic DeNucci and Roberto Soto defeated Gentleman Ken Timms and Killer Carl Cox in 12 minutes 41 seconds. Scott Casey defeated Eddie Mansfield by disqualification at 14 minutes 50 seconds. And then this was the reason I remembered that Randy Savage and Tiger Conway Jr. teaming up is because they got in a fight after the match, which led to this match, which is Randy Savage versus Tiger Conway Jr. And it went to a time limit draw, but that match stole the show. That was the best match on the card by far. Adrian Adonis defeated Vic Peterson. In the semi-main event, Spike Huber and Jerry Oates defeated Tully Blanchard and Toru Tanaka. And then in the main event, King Kong Brody defeated Nikolai Volkov by disqualification in 8 minutes 12 seconds. That was the last card that I attended. They had two more cards after this. So before I talk about the last two cards, at the time this is all going on, I am a very young teenager and I don't really have an appreciation for what running Outlaw is. But I knew if Larry Matysik left the St. Louis Wrestling Club, something drastic had occurred for him to make that decision and then to decide to run a promotion against a place he worked at for so long. I knew as a young fan that really had no concept of what Outlaw was, that it was not good for the St. Louis Wrestling Club that Larry left, nor that he was running a wrestling promotion against them. When I went into the Checker Dome and saw the curtain across, because I've been to a couple hockey games with my dad, when I saw that curtain across the Checker Dome, realized I'm 13, 14 years old, and saw that they couldn't even fill up the half that we had blocked off. I knew it was going to be very difficult for that promotion to survive. I'm a young kid, but I remember thinking they're only using half of this and they're not filling it up. Because I was used to the wrestling cards in St. Louis I went to, they would fill up the arenas that they were in. So I knew that I don't know how long this promotion's going to last, but I also knew it wasn't good for the other St. Louis promotion either, which the current ownership was doing their absolute best to destroy with on their own without any help from Larry. The next card is on October 7th, 1983. So they're trying to run a little bit more frequently, but we don't have the attendance for that. And when I read the card, I think you're going to see the writing was on the wall that maybe this is not going to work. So we went from a few bigger stars in the past card to Brian Madigan versus Brian Mad, the kid from Belleville, versus Bull Brannigan, winner unknown. And this whole card, nobody knows the winner. So I'm guessing that the newspaper did not print the results, which is another bad sign. Luke Williams versus Marty Oates. Marty Oates was Marty Jannetty. Wrestling is the kayfabe brother of Jerry Oates. Donna Day and Anna Jeanette versus Cora Combs and Debbie Combs. And Cora Combs has got to be in her 50s here, or close to it. Chavo Guerrero versus Dutch Mantel. Then a 2-on-1 handicap. Ken Timms and Al Perez versus Nikolai Volkov. Scott Casey, Tiger Conway Jr., and Tom Pritchard defeated Eddie Mansfield, Randy Savage, and Buddy Landell. So we're throwing stuff together that don't make a whole lot of sense. Dominic DiNucci versus Terry Gordy because he couldn't send the Von Erich boys, although David Von Erich told Larry he would wrestle for him. But he did let Terry go up there. Dick Murdoch wrestles Jerry Oates, and Jerry Oates was a big name around St. Louis from his time a couple years ago in the promotion. And then a Texas death match where Spike Huber defeats Tully Blanchard. So that was probably going to be Spike getting a big push. The next card we do have an attendance for, and Larry was drawing almost 7,000 fans in August and September. And now by October 29th, he's back to 5,003 fans. The first match on the card is George Wells versus Luke Williams. The second match is Eddie Mansfield versus Marty Oates, aka Marty Jannetty. Bill Irwin versus Steve Regal. Professor Toru Tanaka and Randy Savage versus Tiger Conway Jr. and Tom Pritchard. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the best use for Randy Savage was not in tag teams. Terry Taylor versus Tully Blanchard. Dick Murdoch and Killer Carl Cox, who they were buddies, defeated Jerry Oates and Scott Casey. So Murdoch is back to being a heel. Dick Murdoch defeats Spike Huber. So now Dick is doing double duty on the card. And I don't know why Murdoch is beating Spike Huber unless Spike, this is the time he started having the trouble with his father in law, Dick the Bruiser. He ended up he was Dick the Bruiser's son in law. He ends up divorcing Dick the Bruiser's daughter, but they end up getting remarried. When he divorced Dick the Bruiser's daughter, Dick the Bruiser went out of his way to try to prevent Spike Huber from getting any bookings. And maybe this is around that time. I don't know when all of that went down. And then the main event was King Kong Brody defeating Nikolai Volkov. And after that card, they pulled the plug on the promotion. Larry goes to work for the WWE. Brody goes back to wrestling for whoever he wants to wrestle. And the promotion goes belly up. The same thing would happen to the St. Louis Wrestling Club 3 years later when they were forced to sell to Jim Crockett Promotions because between their mismanagement and all the competition from the WWE, they could not survive. St. Louis, at least, was still bringing in about 6,000 fans. I don't know what they were doing on the Kansas City end of it. So, my recommendation for this week is Wrestling at the Chase by Larry Matysik. It's mostly a history of the St. Louis promotion, but he does talk about why he started his own promotion. I'm also going to recommend something. I'm not going to review it because I think we went into the history of the promotion here fairly well. There is a show called St. Louis Wrestling 2 on the AWA Stuff YouTube channel, and I will put a link for this in the show notes at kenzermanjr.com, episode 110. But this was one of their early television shows, and I picked this episode because Bruiser Brody and Spike Huber were the stars of this short-lived promotion, and Larry featured both wrestlers on this show. He also has footage at the very end from the two-ring battle royal in St. Louis in July on the July card. One thing I noticed about this show that kind of surprised me was that the regular St. Louis referees, Lee Warren and Ed Smith, worked the card. But I don't know if they got any heat from that. And the reason being is because Missouri had a state athletic commission, which was very involved with the wrestling promotions from the beginning. And they probably assigned Warren and Ed Smith to work the cards for the Greater St. Louis Wrestling Enterprises as well. They would have been referees with the Missouri State Athletic Commission, and they would have been the referees in St. Louis. So they probably would have assigned them to any cards in St. Louis that they had jurisdiction over. So I don't know if they got heat or not. But I'm not going to review that show since we went so deep into the history of this short lived wrestling promotion. That'll be it for this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. As I said earlier, you can find the show notes for this episode at kenzermanjr.com, episode 110. You can also see what I'm currently working on and a list of books I've already written if you're interested in digging deeper into this era of professional wrestling. Thanks for listening today, and until next time, everybody, take care. Bye bye.